They told me I was a burden, like I was something they had to carry, not someone they chose to love. I remember the exact moment it sank in. I was 16, standing at the edge of the driveway, bags packed, tears crusted at the corners of my eyes. My father didn't help me carry a single thing. My mother just stood at the door, arms crossed, her voice sharp and cold. Don't expect us to bail you out when you come crawling back. We've already done more than enough. Done more than enough. I used to think maybe, just maybe, they didn't know how their words hit me like glass. But over the years, I stopped giving them that benefit. No, they knew. They just didn't care. I was the middle child, the invisible one. Rachel, my older sister, was the golden child. Graduated with honors, got a new car at 17, summer intern, lined up before senior year. Evan, my younger brother, was the baby, the precious one. He broke a lamp. He's just a boy. I forgot to vacuum the living room. You're lazy. Why can't you be more like Rachel? No one celebrated when I got accepted into a community college. No one asked what I wanted to study. But they sure remembered to hand me bills. If you're gonna stay in this house, you'd better pull your weight. So I pulled. I worked at a local diner after school, scrubbed toilets, flipped greasy burgers while Rachel got internships in air-conditioned offices. My tips paid for textbooks. My clothes were thrift store finds. I told myself it was temporary. That one day I'd show them. But at night, in that tiny corner of the house they called your room, it was a storage room they cleared out after the dog died. I cried into a pillow to keep quiet. No one came to check on me. They never did. My father once said to me, without flinching, "You're not smart enough to make it. Rachel's the one we're betting on. You'll probably end up back here anyway." That line, it seared itself into my bones. Do you know what it's like to be spoken to like a long-term regret? To feel like every breath you take is a tax someone else has to pay. They never hit me, but the words, the neglect, the silence when I needed kindness the most. That was its own kind of violence. Once, I got pneumonia in my freshman year. I called my mom from the hospital bed, shivering, alone, tubes in my arms. She said, "You'll be fine. I have work in the morning. Call your sister." Rachel never picked up. I stayed 2 days. No one visited. The nurse asked me if I had someone I could call. I shook my head and lied. "I'm fine." I wasn't. But here's the thing. Pain hardens you. Not like armor, no, more like scar tissue. It doesn't make you stronger. It just makes you harder to kill. I started saving every dollar I could. I took on double shifts. Ate ramen and peanut butter sandwiches for weeks on end. I studied at the back of the diner during breaks, books propped open next to cold coffee. I didn't party. I didn't date. I didn't sleep much. I watched other students get weekend money from their parents. New laptops. I fixed mine with duct tape and prayer. Still, I made it. Barely, but I made it. You might think I'm telling you all this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm not. I want you to understand something deeper, what it feels like to grow up in a house full of people and still feel like you're screaming into a void. They never saw me. Not really, and when they did, they only saw what they didn't like. One day, I brought home a small certificate I'd been named Employee of the Month at the diner. It meant something to me. I put it on the fridge. The next morning, it was gone. Thrown away. When I asked about it, my mother said, "Don't act like you cured cancer. It's just a greasy spoon." That's when something inside me cracked. But not in the way they thought. Not in the give-up kind of way. No, that crack let the light in. I knew, right then, I'd have to build something for myself. Not just a career. Not just an escape plan. A life. A full, whole, beautiful life that had nothing to do with their approval. Because I was never going to get it, so I stopped trying. And when you stop needing the love that's being dangled like a poisoned carrot in front of you, you start to build something entirely different. Not out of spite. Not out of vengeance. But out of truth. The truth that I was never the burden. They were the ones who couldn't carry love unless it looked like success. They were the ones who couldn't see value unless it came wrapped in a title or a trophy. But I carried myself, and one day they'd wish I hadn't walked away. They just didn't know it yet. There's something almost holy about the silence you grow into when no one believes in you. It becomes a sanctuary. A forge. I stopped waiting for applause and started listening to the only voice that hadn't turned on me, my own. After I graduated from community college, barely scraping together enough credits and dollars to make it across that stage, I didn't go home. I didn't even tell them the date. No one was in the crowd for me when I walked up and shook the dean's hand. But I wasn't crying this time. I felt something else. Weightless. I was finally, truly, alone but on my own terms. I took the little I had saved and moved 3 hours away to a city where no one knew my name. I found a crumbling studio apartment above a laundromat that reeked of detergent and old cigarettes, with a faucet that screamed every time I turned it on. But it was mine. All mine. I found a job doing admin work at a tiny tech startup. It was the kind of place where no one wore ties and coffee was more important than water. The CEO was barely older than me, and the break room fridge always had a science experiment growing in the back. But something about it sparked. It was chaotic, fast, and barely surviving. Just like me. I didn't have a fancy degree or a connection, but I had something better: an obsession with details, a relentless hunger, and a memory like a vault. Within a year, I went from admin to operations coordinator. I was the one who stayed late, who built the system from scratch when others were too afraid to take risks. They didn't see me coming. Neither did my family. When they did call, rarely it was out of obligation, not curiosity. "How are you?" they'd ask, already half checked out. I gave them nothing. "I'm fine, just working." That was all they needed to hear before moving on to Rachel's latest award or Evan's new girlfriend. I can correct them when they assumed I was still at the diner. Why would I? Sometimes the best revenge is letting people underestimate you. By the time I was 25, the startup had grown into something real. We got funding. Then more. Our CEO had vision but no sense of structure. I filled in the gaps, quietly. By 27, I was, not in title yet but in deed. My fingerprints were on every process, every hire, every pivot. And when the CEO finally burned out, guess who he tapped to replace him? Not Rachel. Not Evan. Me. I became the CEO of a mid-sized tech company before I turned 30. I didn't throw a party. I didn't send out a family group text. I went home, sat on the hardwood floor of my now spacious apartment, and cried. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I had done it, alone, without their money, without their belief, without their help. You ever accomplish something and realize the real win wasn't the success? It was the fact that you didn't become like them in the process. I hired a team. I trained leaders. I built a culture that respected people's time, their voices. We had flexible hours, mental health days, mentorships for first-generation college students. I created the place I had always needed, and then, one summer afternoon, it happened. My phone buzzed. Mom. It had been months, maybe longer. I let it ring. Then I let it ring again. Finally, I picked up. Her voice was unusually sweet, careful. "Hey sweetheart, we were just, wondering how you've been. Your father and I, we heard about your company. From your cousin Alan. He said you're doing very well. CEO now, is that right?" I leaned back in my chair, staring at the skyline. There it was. The shift. The flicker of recognition. Too late, I played dumb. "Yeah, it's going well." She chuckled nervously. "Well, your father's been, in between jobs. You know how the economy is, and we thought. Maybe you'd have something for him. Something simple. He's very organized. Always been good with numbers." I swear I could hear my younger self screaming inside. This is the same man who told you you'd never make it. The same one who laughed when you said you wanted to study business. And now he's asking you for a job. I let the silence hang. And then, softly, I said, "We're not hiring right now." There was a pause. Then, "Well, maybe later." "Maybe," I replied. "But we're pretty selective." She didn't respond. Just a small, almost imperceptible sigh. And then, "We're proud of you." My throat tightened. Too little, too late. I didn't need it anymore. But I'll admit it still landed. Somewhere deep, not because I needed their pride, but because it finally came after they had nothing left to offer. They only saw value once the world did. And that told me everything. You see, the most dangerous people are the ones who confuse love with leverage, who see worth only when it can serve them, who hold back praise like it's a currency you have to earn with pain. But not anymore. Not anymore. Not for me. I built a life no one could take credit for but me. And that was just the beginning. You ever watch someone walk into a room they swore you'd never belong in and suddenly realize they're the ones who don't fit? That's what it felt like when my parents showed up at my office. They didn't call ahead. No warning. Just appeared. I'd just finished a quarterly meeting. high off our strongest growth yet. I was walking down the hallway with my assistant when I saw them sitting stiffly on the sleek leather couch in the reception area, like two kids waiting outside a principal's office. My mother clutched her purse like it was a lifeline. My father wore the same scowl he always had, only this time, it looked like it weighed more. They stood when they saw me, all smiles and nervous energy, and I just froze, not out of fear, not from anger, but because for the first time, I wasn't the one, unsure of myself. Sweetheart, my mother started, arms already open for a hug. I didn't move. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't cold, I was calm, too calm. Why are you here? That caught her off guard. She blinked, pulling her arms back. Well, we thought we'd come by, see your office. You know, show support. Support, what a word, it echoed in my chest. Like a joke, only I understood. I turned to my assistant. Could you give us the room? She nodded and disappeared, leaving just the three of us in that glass-walled lobby where everything I had built surrounded us like a monument. To the girl they never believed in, they sat back down. I didn't. I stayed standing, arms crossed, eyes clear. What do you want? There was a long pause. Then my father cleared his throat. I've been trying to get back into work, he said, but things haven't worked out. I've got years of experience, but I guess companies want ... younger blood now. He looked at me, not with shame but with expectation. That's when it hit me. They weren't here to reconnect. They weren't here to apologize. They were here for a favor. A job. A handout from the daughter they had once written off as useless. My mother leaned in. We thought maybe you might have something available. Even part-time. Your father's always been good with logistics. And well, I could do front desk. Or HR. HR. The same woman who called my anxiety dramatic and my ambition delusional now wanted to manage people. I wanted to laugh, but I didn't, because there was something sad in their eyes. Not sadness for what they did to me, no. That would have required self-awareness. It was sadness for themselves. For what they'd lost. For the life they thought they were guaranteed, now slipping through their fingers like sand. I walked to the window and looked down at the street below. Cars honking. People rushing. Everyone chasing something. Then I turned back to them. You remember when I was 16 and had to take the bus to 3 different jobs just to afford tuition? My mother's lips tightened. You told me, I continued, that I was a burden. That if I left, I was on my own. That I'd come crawling back. They said nothing. I stepped closer. Well, I didn't crawl, I climbed. My father shifted uncomfortably. We didn't mean you meant every word. Silence. Heavy. Like wet wool. Then I added, slowly, and now you're here. In the building I run. Asking me to undo the damage you did because it's finally inconvenient for you. My mother opened her mouth again, then closed it. Her eyes dropped to the floor, and here's the thing, this wasn't the revenge I dreamed of. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clean, empty maybe, but in the way a wound feels clean after the infection is cut out. I don't think this is the right fit for either of you, I said finally. My father's jaw tensed. You're really gonna turn your back on us? I took a breath. No, I'm just done bending over backwards for people who only reach out when they need something. My mother whispered, but we're family. That word. That damn word. No, I said. We're blood. Family shows up when you're broke, not just when you're booming. I walked to the door and held it open. They sat for a beat too long, then rose, stiffly. My mother passed by me first. I thought maybe she'd say something. Maybe she'd reach for my hand. Offer an apology. But she just walked out. My father followed, but stopped at the threshold. You've changed. I met his eyes. No, I just stopped needing you to see me. And then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind them. I stood there for a moment longer, not crying, not shaking, just breathing. They came expecting to find the desperate daughter they left behind. But she wasn't here anymore. She had built an empire from the scraps they gave her. And now she was protecting it. I wish I could tell you that was the end of it. That they left that day with their heads bowed in quiet realization. Went home, and sat with their guilt like civilized people. That they finally saw me, not the version they'd edited and rewritten to make themselves feel better. But no. That's not how people like them operate. You see, when someone's built their entire identity on being right about you, on being better than you, your success becomes a threat. It isn't inspiring. It's offensive. It reminds them of everything they refuse to see, and worse. It exposes the fact that you never needed them. A week after they left my office, I got a call from Rachel. Of course, Rachel, golden child, daddy's perfect girl. The one they did show up for. I hadn't heard from her in over a year, since she got promoted to some corporate role that involved a lot of conferences and little actual power. "Hey stranger," she said, like we were old friends catching up. I knew immediately they'd sent her. "How's everything?" she asked, all sugary surface. I didn't play along. Cut to it. She laughed, that condescending laugh she's had since middle school. "Okay, fine. Look, I know Mom and Dad came by. They told me what happened, did they?" I said, flatly. "Yeah," she replied. "And I just think maybe you were a little harsh. I mean, Dad's struggling. You've got this great company now. Isn't that what family's for?" There it was again, family-weaponized. Used like a crowbar to pry open a door. I had every right to keep locked. I said nothing. She continued. "You know, they weren't perfect, but they did their best. And you turning them away like that? It just seems vindictive." I almost laughed. Vindictive. This. From the woman who once told our entire extended family that I dropped out of college to be a barista, who deleted my birthday post the one time I shared about my promotion because it was too braggy, who stood silent every time Mom called me dramatic and Dad rolled his eyes when I talked about anything that mattered to me. "You don't get to rewrite the story now, Rachel," I said, voice calm, but sharp. "You watched it happen. You benefited from it." There was a pause. Then, the classic defensive pivot. "So what? Now you think you're better than us because you made money." "No," I said. "I know I'm not better than anyone. But I am better than the version of myself who used to beg for scraps of love from people who were allergic to giving it." Silence again then. Quietly, "They're hurting, you know. And so was I replied. "For years, but no one checked on me then." She sighed. "I just thought maybe you could show a little grace." That word again. Grace. As if grace was owed to those who weaponized your weakness. As if survival came with a moral debt to those who'd rather you stayed small. I said, "Grace doesn't mean reopening wounds. It means choosing peace. And peace, Rachel, is not giving people access to you just because you share a last name." She went quiet after that. The call ended shortly after. I sat in my apartment, staring out at the city I now called home. I thought about all the versions of me that had died along the way. The girl who cried when her college rejection letter came, and her father said, "What did you expect?" The teen who worked late shifts while her siblings had car rides and allowances. The young woman who moved alone with $57 to her name and no one to call when her pipes burst. The woman who had finally stopped apologizing for taking up space. All of them. Gone, and in their place. Me. Not a success story for their approval. Not a cautionary tale for their pride. Just a woman who finally knew her worth didn't live in their gaze. You ever wonder how many people would still love you if you stopped performing for their comfort? I stopped, and the silence I was left with, it was honest, it was mine, and in that silence, something else grew bigger than resentment. Deeper than pride. Clarity, the kind of clarity that doesn't scream, doesn't beg, doesn't shake with rage, it just says, "No more." That's what I told myself when they emailed me again, asking if I'd be willing to consider a small investment opportunity for Evan, something he'd dreamed up with a friend. "A favor," they said. "To support your brother." I didn't respond. Not out of malice, but because I no longer had anything to prove. Let them twist the story. Let them paint me as cold. They don't know what warmth it takes to survive the freeze of their silence. They don't know how much discipline it takes to heal without bitterness. And they don't get to be part of this chapter. Not anymore. I built this life with hands they tried to tie behind my back. And now, I walk freely forward. There's a quiet grief that comes not from loss, but from realization the moment you accept that the people who were supposed to love you the most never really saw you. It's not dramatic. It's not loud. It just settles. A slow understanding that they loved the idea of you, the version that fit their expectations, but never the real you, the inconvenient, ambitious, emotionally complex version that didn't smile on cue or play the part they wrote. I remember the first time I referred to them not as my family, but as my parents. Just my parents. Stripped of affection, detached, clinical. It felt foreign, and then freeing, because when someone spends years tearing you down and only shows up when you've built something, they want a piece of it's not a relationship, it's a transaction. And I no longer offered credit. It had been 3 months since their last attempt at contact. 3 months of silence. No emails, no visits, no just checking in calls from Rachel, which used to be code for damage control. 3 months where, for the first time in my life, the only voices in my head were mine. Not my father's cutting cynicism, not my mother's guilt-laced disappointment, not Rachel's syrupy superiority masked as concern, just mine. And let me tell you, real silence isn't empty. It's clarifying. I spent that time pouring myself into my company. Not to prove anything, but because I loved what I was building. It was honest, tangible. Mine, the team I had assembled wasn't just smart and talented, they were kind. They saw me in ways my own family never did. When I walked into the office, there was laughter, respect, genuine warmth. It was surreal. Being loved without needing to earn it through performance. One afternoon, we had a team celebration. We'd landed a major partnership with a global firm, something that would triple our reach. There was champagne, cheers, a toast from my head of strategy, who ended his speech with, "And to the woman who made all this happen, who dared to believe when no one else did." And the room erupted. They clapped, not because I was their boss, but because they believed in me. I excused myself quietly after that, stepped out onto the terrace, and let the cold air settle into my lungs. That's when I saw it. A notification on my phone. A message from Rachel. "I think you should come home. Mom's not well." For a second, everything slowed. It's the trickiest card of all, isn't it? Illness, the one that bypasses boundaries, the one that tries to turn pain into obligation. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I sat there, watching the city skyline shimmer in dusk's golden hour. And I thought, would I have gone if she'd gotten sick 3 years ago? Yes. Not out of love, out of guilt, out of that sick gnawing need to be a good daughter, a need they had planted in me like a weed growing wild, strangling my sense of self. But now I was different. I texted back, eventually, "I'm sorry to hear that. I hope she gets the care she needs." That was it. No offer to visit, no performance, just honesty. She replied with, "Seriously? She's your mother." To which I answered, "She hasn't been, not really. And you know that." I put my phone away and returned to the party. That night, I sat in my apartment, looking through old boxes, photos, letters, report cards with "doesn't apply herself" scribbled in red ink, college brochures I never got to apply to, a birthday card from my high school graduation with no money inside and a note that said, "You'll understand how hard life is when you grow up." And then, tucked at the bottom, a journal entry I wrote when I was 17. I read it aloud. "I just want them to be proud of me. I want them to hug me without sighing. I want them to say I'm not a burden. I want them to see me." I held that page for a long time. And then I lit a match, watched it curl and disappear. Not in bitterness, in release. You see, people think the hardest part of healing is forgiving. But it's not. It's accepting that the apology may never come. That closure might not arrive wrapped in redemption. Sometimes, closure looks like not answering the door when they finally knock. Sometimes it sounds like your own voice saying no. Sometimes it's just peace and realizing you no longer need their love to validate your worth. And that's freedom. It was a Tuesday. The kind of day where nothing extraordinary was supposed to happen until it did. I was in the middle of reviewing our newest mentorship grant initiatives, something close to my heart. We were creating scholarships and placements for young adults who'd grown up in unstable homes, kids who'd been told they'd never amount to anything, kids like me. That's when my assistant knocked lightly and said, "There's someone here to see you." I didn't even look up. "Do they have an appointment?" She hesitated. "It's your father." I froze. That word felt ancient in my mouth. Father, like a title someone held in another lifetime. I looked up slowly. "Did he say what he wants?" She nodded, almost apologetically. "He has a resume." A resume? It was laughable, really. If you'd told me years ago that the man who once told me I was dead weight would one day show up trying to work for me, I'd have laughed in your face. But there he was, in the lobby, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit anymore, holding a worn leather folder. I told her to let him in. I wanted to see this, not out of cruelty, out of clarity. He stepped into my office like it was foreign territory. His eyes roamed the shelves, lined with awards, books, framed photographs, a world he'd never asked about. "Nice place," he said. Like we were equals. Like he hadn't told me I was too sensitive to last a year in business. I didn't offer him a seat. He stood awkwardly, then held out the folder. Figured I'd see if you were hiring. I didn't touch it. Instead, I leaned back and asked, why? He blinked. Well, you've built something impressive, and I've got experience. Might as well put it to use. That's what he said. Might as well put it to use. No apology, no reflection, just a transaction. I tilted my head. You know I have a full HR process. You could have applied online like everyone else. His jaw tightened. So I'm just some stranger now. And there it was. The guilt card. I looked him dead in the eyes. You always were. He flinched. I went on, voice calm, deliberate. You didn't come when I opened my first office. You didn't call when I landed our first contract. You didn't show up when I got my award at City Hall. But now that I've made something you can use. He cut in, defensive. It's not like that. I laughed. Not out of humor, out of exhaustion. It's exactly like that. You couldn't be bothered when I was struggling, when I needed help with rent, with groceries, with encouragement. But now that I have a building, a brand, a team, you want in. He said nothing, so I stepped closer. You called me a burden. His shoulders slumped. You told me I was selfish for not supporting Evan through his startup that burned all your savings. Still no response. I softened just a little. Do you know how many strangers believed in me before you ever? Did his mouth opened, then closed? Do you know what it cost me to get here? I didn't mean money. I meant nights crying on the bathroom floor, questioning if I was even capable of being more than what they said. I meant swallowing rejections, hiding tears, showing up to meetings with red eyes and forced smiles. I meant healing myself without their help. Finally, he looked down. I was wrong. I didn't know. No, I said. You didn't want to know. He exhaled. Heavy. I thought if I pushed you harder, you rise. That you'd thank me someday. I shook my head slowly. You didn't push me. You ignored me. And now that I've risen, it's not gratitude you want, it's access. A long silence. Then he whispered, I don't expect forgiveness. Good, I replied. Because I'm not offering it. Not today. He nodded. But if there's anything I can do to make it right. I gestured to the folder still clutched in his hand. You can start by walking out with that. This isn't the door you get to come through. He stood there a moment, longer, as if hoping I'd change my mind. But I didn't. He left. No threats, no tears. Just a man finally realizing that time doesn't rewind. Later that evening, Rachel texted again. He told me you humiliated him. I didn't reply. Because I hadn't humiliated anyone. I'd just told the truth. And sometimes the truth sounds cruel to those who spent years silencing it. I was done explaining, done justifying, because there comes a moment in every survivor's story where they stop looking back. Not out of anger but because the future finally feels more home than the past ever did. That moment had come, and I had never felt more powerful. I thought that would be the end of it. The resume, the awkward exchange, the door closed behind my father like punctuation at the end of a story I never chose to write. But families like mine don't leave quietly. A week later, Rachel called. I almost didn't answer but curiosity got the better of me. Look, she said, skipping any greeting. I know you've been harsh. But I think we need to talk. There was a tremor in her voice. Not anger, something more fragile, like fear, dressed up as composure. About what? I asked, cold but steady. She hesitated. Then, about Mom. She's in the hospital. Again, and this time, it's serious. I waited. She went on. They found something. In her lungs. It's not good. I didn't say anything. Because I'd learned that not all silence is cruelty. Sometimes it's self-preservation. She wants to see you, Rachel added. There it was. The familiar script. The pull of obligation. The whisper of guilt. Behind every word. You'll regret it if you don't. You're still her daughter. You're still family. Family. Word. Had been used against me like a weapon my entire life. When they wanted favors, they said it sweetly. When I needed support, they wielded it like a chain. Where family had never meant I love you. In our house, it had always meant you owe us. Still, something in me softened. Maybe it was years of conditioning. Maybe it was just the weight of mortality settling in. Maybe it was my need to look this whole twisted saga in the eye and end it on my terms. So I went, not with flowers, not with forgiveness, but with clarity. The hospital was cold in that way. Only hospitals are oversapitized, underlit, filled with quiet dread. I walked through the hallway like a ghost in my own memories. My shoes echoing against tile, My breath tight in my throat. She looked smaller than I remembered, thinner, more fragile, like someone who had lost more than time could measure. Her eyes flickered open as I stepped into the room. For a moment, silence stretched between us like a wire. And then, "You look successful." A statement, not a compliment. I pulled a chair closer. I am another silence. She turned her face to the side. "I heard what happened with your father. He said you humiliated him." "He showed up with a resume," I said, flatly, "to the company he once said I'd never be capable of building." She didn't respond. I studied her face. The same lips that once told me to stop acting like a victim. The same eyes that watched Rachel's wedding from the front row while I was seated in the back. The same hands that held Evan through every failure but never reached for me when I was breaking. "I came," I said finally, "because I wanted you to know something." She turned back toward me. "I forgive you, but not for you. For me." Her brows knit slightly, as if confused. "Forgive me for what?" That right there." I breathed in slowly. "For not believing in me. For telling me I was a burden. For never once asking what I needed. For choosing favorites and pretending it was love. For only reaching out when things got bad enough that you wanted something from me." Still, she said nothing. I continued. "I spent years wondering what was wrong with me. Why I wasn't enough for you. Why my successes weren't celebrated unless they made you look good. Why my sadness made you uncomfortable instead of compassionate." I paused. "But now I see it wasn't me. It was never me." Her lip trembled slightly. Age had made her face more transparent. Or maybe I had just stopped making excuses for what I saw. "I'm doing well," I said. "Better than you could have imagined. And none of it was thanks to you." She blinked but didn't cry. And then, after a long moment, she whispered, "But we're family." There it was. The final invocation. The last lifeline of a dynasty built on denial. I shook my head. "No. We're people who share blood. That's not the same thing." She didn't respond. Maybe she couldn't, and for the first time in my life, I didn't need her to. I stood. "You wanted to see me. Now you have." She looked at me like a stranger watching a door close behind them. I left the hospital lighter. Not because I'd gotten closure, but because I'd chosen it for myself. You see, there's a moment in every story, like Mina Final Shift, where the need to be seen by the people who broke you is replaced by the joy of being seen by yourself. It doesn't come with fanfare. It comes quietly in hospital rooms, in ignored resumes, in long silences that no longer hurt. And from that silence, a new voice emerges, your own. Unapologetic, undeniable, and free. You think the confrontation is the climax? You think once you say your piece, once you walk out of the hospital room, or send the door closing behind a parent who once called you worthless, that it's done. But it isn't. Because people who are used to power don't let go easily, and family that fed on your silence often can't stomach your strength, so they circle back always. I was hosting a client dinner, one of those rare, high-stakes evenings where the wine costs more than most people's rent and everyone pretends not to be impressed by how many zeros are on the check. I'd bought out the entire restaurant. Not because I needed to show off. Because I could. Because it was mine now. The very restaurant I once used to wash dishes in when I was 19 and sleeping on a friend's floor after my mother told me I needed to grow up and stop blaming everyone for my choices. That restaurant had changed owners 3 times. I bought it in cash, renamed it quietly, didn't even tell the press. Some things don't need noise, they just need presence. And that night, while I was shaking hands with international partners and watching my executive team hold their own like the brilliant stars they sobbed them. In the corner, my brother Evan and my parents, they hadn't made a reservation. They had no idea I owned the place. They were just there. Looking for a fancy meal, I suppose. I should have let it go. I really should have. But healing doesn't always mean silence, so I walked over. Calmly. They froze when they saw me. Rachel, for once, wasn't there. Just the trio of ghosts I'd spent my life trying to stop haunting me. My father spoke first. "Of course. Didn't expect to see you here." I smiled. "I own it." He blinked. My mother, awkwardly fidgeting with her menu, said, "It's very elegant." "Thank you," I said. "We renovated last year. Closed for 2 months. Rebuilt everything from the floors up." Evan gave me a tight smile. "Looks expensive." "It is," I said. "We're fully booked tonight." He raised an eyebrow. "Even this table?" I didn't look away. "Especially this table." For a long moment, no one said a word. Then my father leaned forward. Come on, we're just here to eat. No drama. I let that hang in the air a moment. Then, I'd be happy to comp the meal. My mother's face brightened. Really? I nodded, as a farewell gift. Their faces fell. I continued, softly. You came for a meal. I came for a moment, and this is it. Evan frowned. You think you're better than us now? I met his eyes. No. I know I don't need to be anything for you anymore. They didn't respond, so I left. Didn't say goodbye. Didn't look back. Just returned to my clients, poured a glass of wine, and raised a silent toast to the table in the corner that would never have a seat for me again. That night, I walked home, no driver, no fanfare. Just me and the city lights, my heels clicking like a metronome of a life well built. And I thought about all the nights I'd cried for their approval, all the years I'd bartered my peace for the hope of being chosen, and how none had been necessary. Because the truth is, you don't have to earn love from people who only ever loved you conditionally. You don't have to shrink so others feel taller. You don't have to explain your joy to people who only cheered for your suffering. You just have to live loudly, fully, unapologetically, because that is the sweetest revenge. Not the restaurant, not the title, not even their shock, but the peace that comes from knowing you are enough, Evan, when they never saw it. Especially when they never saw it. It started with a message. Then 3 missed calls. Then a voicemail, shaky, breathless, from my father. Evan messed up. Badly. We need help. Please. No details. No explanations. Just desperation delivered like a sledgehammer to the life I'd built so far from theirs. I ignored it at first because I'd learned the hard way that their emergencies had a way of only surfacing when I was no longer useful to them. Every time they remembered I existed, it came wrapped in self-interest. But the calls kept coming. Dozens, then hundreds. Rachel messaged just 3 words. He's being sued, so I finally asked around. Turns out, Evan had tried to launch his own company, a tech consultancy. Something generic and bloated with buzzwords, and it had gone south. Bad contracts. Investors pulling out. And now one of his biggest clients was suing him for breach of intellectual property. He could lose everything, including the house Dad co-signed for. The irony, his company vision was a watered-down version of what I'd built 5 years ago. He hadn't even bothered to change the pitch structure, just took what he remembered from family dinners and tried to copy it with cheaper labor and louder branding. And now, in the burning wreckage of that imitation, they turned to me. The disappointment, the invisible one, the burden. I didn't respond, not out of cruelty but because silence had finally become my clearest boundary. Then came the letter, handwritten, from my mother. Dear Vanessa, I know we haven't always been close. I know we've made mistakes, but please understand, Evan is your brother. Family doesn't turn its back in moments like this. If there's anything you can do to help, please do it. We're proud of what you've achieved. We really are. Love, Mom. Proud. They were proud now, not when I spent nights on buses to get to night school. Not when I went years without holidays, scrubbing contracts and fixing failed code just to prove I had value. Not when I opened my first office and invited them to the ribbon cutting only to be told Rachel had a baby shower and that was more important. But now, when their golden child needed saving, they were proud. I didn't call. Instead, I drafted a letter of my own. I didn't say I forgave them. I didn't say I'd help. I simply wrote, every decision has consequences. I've spent most of my life absorbing the cost of choices I didn't make. I won't anymore. I hope Evan finds a way forward. But that journey won't include me. And I sent it. I didn't wait for a reply. Because there's a peace in not needing one. You see, here's what no one tells you. When you finally rise, when the people who broke you come crawling back, not with apologies but with asks, you face a second test. Not of strength, but of self-worth, because it's so tempting to say yes, to throw them a rope, and finally be recognized for the value they once denied. But that's the final trap. That's how the cycle continues. You don't owe them your rescue, especially when they never gave you a lifeline of your own. A week later, I saw a news article. Evan's company filed for bankruptcy. There was a photo of him in court, hair disheveled, suit slightly wrinkled. My father standing behind him with a jaw clenched so hard it looked painful. The caption, Startup Wonderboy, faces legal reckoning. Wonderboy, what a title. I closed the tab, not with joy, not with bitterness, but with quiet detachment. His storm was no longer mine, and that was the real victory. It was a tech leadership summit. One of those massive, glittering events where CEOs swap war stories on stage and everyone nods solemnly at buzzwords like agility and disruption. I had been invited as the keynote speaker. Headliner: Vanessa Powell, founder, visionary, outsider-turned-mogul. The irony. 5 years ago, I couldn't afford the parking fee at this venue. Now they were flying me in on a private jet, offering a dressing room, asking if I wanted sparkling or still. I chose still. My voice didn't need bubbles to cut as I stood backstage. Mic clipped to my collar, notes in hand that I wouldn't use. I checked my phone out of habit. There was a message waiting. Rachel, Mom and Dad are here. They want to talk to you. They're in the third row. My stomach didn't drop. Not anymore. There was a time long ago when that message would have made my hands shake, when the possibility of being seen by them, really seen, would have unraveled me, but not now. I'd built a new reality brick by brutal brick and it no longer rested on their scaffolding. I stepped onto that stage and met 1,000 eyes. But I only looked at 3.3rd row. Left side. Middle seats. My parents and Rachel, sitting stiffly like people trying too hard to seem natural. My father had aged, his suit a size too big. My mother looked polished, her pearls too perfect. I nodded. Once, cool Sybil. Distant. Then I spoke. Not to them but to the room. My name is Vanessa Powell, and if you'd asked me 10 years ago who I was, I might have hesitated. I might have said, just someone trying to make rent. Or, just the disappointing daughter. Or maybe I wouldn't have said anything at all. There was a soft murmur. People leaned in. But today, I know who I am. I am proof that failure isn't fatal. That being underestimated is not a curse but a gift. Because when people don't believe in you, they stop watching. And when they stop watching, you get to build without their noise. I paused, met the eyes of a young woman in the front row. She looked like me a decade ago. Torn jeans, tight jaw, hope hidden under hurt. I spent years trying to be enough. Enough for teachers, bosses, lovers, and, yes, family. And then one day, I stopped trying to be enough for them, and started being everything for me. Applause. Soft at first, I continued. I didn't come from wealth, or support, or even warmth. I came from silence. But sometimes, silence is where the fire starts. That was when the room erupted. Standing ovation. My parents clapped too, but I didn't look at them again. Not out of spite, out of choice. Afterward, in the velvet quiet of backstage, Rachel found me. She didn't cry this time. She just said, "They want to see you. For real. No agenda." I shrugged lightly. "You saw what they needed to see. Vanessa, I'm not angry," I said. And I wasn't. I just don't need anything from them anymore. That's the difference. She nodded, looked down at her shoes. Then, like peeling off old skin, she whispered, "I was jealous of you. I still am." That caught me. "Why?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Because you left," she said, "and you survived. You think the finish line is the forgiveness, but sometimes it's just this. Being able to stand on a stage with the people who broke you sitting in the audience. And not flinch, to no longer need an apology to be whole, to not feel small. Even when they pretend they never made you feel that way. To simply be seen and not shaken. That is healing. That is power. And power, real power, doesn't come from revenge, it comes from release." They asked me to dinner. Not in some crowded, neutral restaurant downtown but in the same house I once cried myself to sleep in. Night after night. The same hallway where my name was always the one. Forgotten. The same kitchen where Evan's birthday cake always had 3 layers. And mine came from a grocery store shelf. "We just want to reconnect," Mom had said over the phone, her voice light, too careful. Like she was trying to sound rehearsed and spontaneous at once. And for the first time, I said yes. Not because I needed anything from them, but because I was finally curious to see who they'd become without needing them to see me differently. I brought nothing. No wine, no flowers, just presence. And power. They opened the door with the same awkward warmth that always coated family guilt. Dad patted my shoulder like I was an employee returning from leave. Mom kissed the air near my cheek. Rachel gave me a tight smile, like an apology stitched shut. The dining table was set for 6, but Evan's seat was empty. "Where is he?" I asked. "Still recovering," Mom said. "He's not ready to see people yet." But I knew. He couldn't bear to sit across from the sister whose silence had let him fall. Dinner was a minefield of niceties. Roast chicken, 2 dry wine, Conversations stretched thinner than the napkins. They asked about my business tentatively, like people scared of saying the wrong acronym. Dad said, "I heard you work with that big security firm now. What's it called?" Mom chimed in, "And your office in New York looks beautiful in the photos." I let the comments fall, one by one. Then, halfway through the meal, Mom reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. It was meant to be tender, but it felt like a contract. "We're proud of you, Vanessa, truly. And we know we didn't always show it the right way. But we want to do better now. Be involved, if that's okay." I looked at her fingers rings gleaming under the overhead light and felt that strange sensation again. The absence of want. You ever feel that? When you realize you're no longer reaching for the thing that once ruled your entire being? That the people you once begged to see you are now knocking on a door you already walked through? I took a sip of water, then answered, "I'm not the same girl who left this house, and I don't want to pretend I am." Mom's smile faltered. "I'm open to having you in my life," I said clearly, "but only on my terms. No expectations. No sudden asks. No shifting blame." Dad cleared his throat. "Vanessa, no one's blaming anyone." "That's good," I said, folding my napkin. "Because I'm not here to clean up anymore." Silence, a long one. Rachel was the first to nod. "Okay," she said. "That's fair." When I left that night, they stood at the doorway again. Same positions, same plastered warmth, but I walked away lighter. Because for once, I wasn't hoping they'd follow me. They could stay in their house. I had my own. That dinner didn't fix anything. It wasn't some magical reconciliation drenched in emotional violins. It was an introduction to boundaries, to the adult version of me. And the truth is, sometimes healing doesn't look like hugs and shared desserts. Sometimes it's just a seat at the table, claimed on your own terms. A fork that never trembles in your hand. And the power to leave when you're ready, not when someone slams the door. There's a strange ache that comes with realizing you're real. Family might not be the one you were born into, but the one you built with bare hands and earned loyalty. I used to mourn that. There was a time I thought it made me broken, drifting in the world without roots, without a mother who called just to hear my voice, or a father who asked if I was sleeping enough. But then something changed. Or maybe I changed, because somewhere along the journey, in the quiet trenches of work, sweat, and slow faith, I found people who showed up, mentors who stayed after hours to help me rework a failed pitch, teammates who brought soup when I had the flu and still showed up for the 8 a.m. call, investors who bet on me not because of my surname but because of my fire. My assistant, Claire, once booked me a week in the countryside after a brutal boardroom fallout, not because it was her job, but because she noticed the tremble in my voice when I said I was fine. She's Family.Jonas, my lead developer. Built the app from scratch beside me every single night for 3 months straight. Even while his own marriage was falling apart. He never asked for credit. He just believed. He's family. The barista at the cafe, 2 blocks from HQ, who never got my name wrong, who learned I liked cinnamon even when I forgot to say it. He's family, too, in his own way. When I got my first major award, some glass triangle with my name etched in gold, I didn't call my parents. I called Claire and Jonas and the woman who let me rent her basement for half the market price when I had no credit score, no savings, and no backup plan. They all showed up to the ceremony. None of them were in my baby photos, but all of them were in my victories. So no, blood isn't always thicker than water. Sometimes blood is just a contract you didn't sign. Sometimes water poured patiently consistently grows more roots than blood ever did. You don't need DNA to be loved properly. You don't need a shared last name to be chosen every day. That's what they never taught me in that house on Sycamore Street. That's what I had to learn on my own, in the late nights and lonely airports. That home isn't a place, it's people and family. Family are the ones who don't flinch when you fail. They just roll up their sleeves and say, "What do you need?" You, the one listening. Maybe you have a family like mine. Maybe your victories echo into silence. Maybe your pain is met with deflection and your joy with jealousy. Maybe you've never had a welcome home. That didn't come with conditions, but hear me now. You are not alone. Your real people may still be waiting for you on the road ahead, holding signs with your name, even if they haven't met you yet. And you are not unlovable. You were just never watered by the right hands. But you are here now, still blooming, still becoming, and you get to choose your garden. It started with an email. Subject line: "Let's explore partnership opportunities." The sender: Evan J. Thompson, my brother, the one who hadn't shown up to that dinner, the one who used to call my work. A cute little idea at Thanksgiving. The one who once told a friend loud enough for me to overhear, "Vanessa just doesn't have the mind for real business." And now, apparently, he wanted to collaborate. It would have been funny if it didn't sting so strangely. His email was polished. Buzzword heavy, something about leveraging sibling synergy and family-based branding. He even attached a deck. I didn't open it, but I did call my lawyer. Not to sue him, to protect myself, because I knew what this was. Evan's startup was failing. I'd heard whispers in the investor circles, quiet sell-offs, a patent dispute, an ex-coup walking out mid-quarter, and now, suddenly, he remembered he had a sister. A week later, I got the second email. This one was from Mom. It was longer, more sentimental. "Sweetheart," it began. "We're so proud of what you've built. Truly. And we've been talking as a family. Evan's struggling, and he could really benefit from being around someone with your drive and vision. It would mean the world if you could just consider helping him find his footing again." No apology for the years of dismissal. No mention of how they used to laugh behind my back when I tried to crowdfund my first idea. Just a mother suddenly remembering how bright her daughter was because the son was drowning. You ever felt your stomach harden like a wall? That's what it felt like reading that. Not rage, not heartbreak, just resolve. I didn't respond to either email. Instead, I invited them to the office. A controlled environment, one where I held the key card, the agenda, the narrative. I had the front desk prepare guest badges that read visitor, family. It wasn't petty. It was ... surgical. They arrived dressed like they were going to church and court at once, Mom in her pearls, Dad in his old tailored suit, Evan pretending not to look at the nameplate on my office door. CEO, Vanessa Powell. That name used to embarrass them. Now it was their golden ticket. They sat. I stood, and I asked, point blank, "Why are you here?" Evan looked down, then back up, all wounded pride and rehearsed humility. "I think we both know I made some mistakes, but maybe we can help each other now. Your company's growing fast. I've got connections, ideas. I could bring value." I smiled. Then I said something I'd waited decades to say: "You can't sit at a table you spent years trying to flip." He blinked. I turned to my parents. "And you can't claim pride in someone you never invested in emotionally, financially, or otherwise." Mom tried to protest, her voice catching, "But we're your..." "No," I interrupted. "You're my relatives. You chose your favorite. You bet on the wrong horse. And now you're asking me to carry the one who laughed when I fell." Evan's face flushed. "I'm not asking for charity." I stepped closer. "Good. Because I don't give charity to people who once called me a burden." They left in silence. No one said thank you. No one said sorry. But I watched their shoulders slump as the elevator doors closed, like people watching a train they thought was theirs pull away from the platform. That day, I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. Because it wasn't about revenge. It was about clarity. And you know what I realized? I didn't need them to crawl back. I just needed them to see what they threw away. And now they had you. Listening. If your family ever tries to reap what they never sowed, remember, it's not cruel to say no. It's not ungrateful to protect what you built with broken hands. Sometimes the best justice is peace. And peace comes from boundaries that hold. Even when blood knocks hard. I thought I was alone in the silence. That I was the only one who remembered the slights, the ignored birthdays, the unspoken comparisons, the way they handed my dreams a broom and told me to clean up after Evan's ambitions. But then she called. Emily. My sister, the one who had always played the quiet diplomat, the peacekeeper, the one who kept her head down and her hands clean while the house burned. I hadn't heard from her in almost 2 years, so when her name flashed on my phone, I hesitated and picked up. "Hey," she said, softly. My throat tightened. "Hi." There was a pause. Long, heavy, honest. Then, I saw the article about your company. The Forbes one. I waited. "I'm sorry," she whispered. For all of it, I didn't say anything at first, not because I didn't feel something, but because I felt everything. Grief, rage, gratitude, and that strange, fragile hope that a sister's voice still had the power to shake something loose in me. She continued. "I was there," she said, "but I wasn't with you. I knew how they treated you. I saw the favoritism. I heard what they said behind closed doors." My breath caught. I should have spoken up, she said. But I was scared. Scared they'd turn on me too. Scared they'd say I was just like you. That landed hard, not because it hurt, but because I understood I had lived that fear too. Being just like me used to be an accusation in our family. Now, it was a badge of honor. She told me things I didn't know, like how Evan used to intercept letters I sent her during college. How Mom would scoff any time I got mentioned in conversation. How Dad once told her, Vanessa always had a flair for the dramatic. She'd crash eventually. And how, behind closed doors, they chalked up every one of my accomplishments to luck. That word again, luck. As if sleepless nights and sacrifice were just spinning dice. As if grit came bottled, sold by chance. I don't want anything, Emily said, her voice trembling. I want you to know I saw it. I saw you. And I admire you more than anyone else I know. I didn't cry, but my silence did. We talked for an hour. About childhood. About memory. About how healing sometimes comes dressed like confession. And when she asked if we could meet, just the two of us, I said yes. Because unlike them, she hadn't come with a pitch deck or a favor. She came with the truth. And sometimes that's enough to start again. I don't know if we'll ever be close. Maybe we're too far down different roads. But in that moment, she gave me something my parents never did. Validation, not for the empire I built, but for the little girl I was, the one who used to press her ears against closed doors and wonder why love was being whispered so far away. You, listening maybe. Someone in your family betrayed you. Maybe someone stayed silent when they should have spoken. Maybe they weren't evil, just cowardly. It doesn't erase the damage, but sometimes, someone comes back not with excuses, but with acknowledgement, and that can begin to fill the cracks. If you decide it's worth it. Because healing isn't about forgetting, it's about being seen, fully, finally, and sometimes, that changes everything. I no longer flinch when someone calls me resilient. Because now, I know exactly what that word costs. Resilience isn't a badge. It's a scar that learned how to tell a better story. I used to believe that if I worked hard enough, loved hard enough, they'd come around. That one day, Mom would say she was proud without the bitter aftertaste of obligation. That Dad would look at me and see something other than a failed prototype of Evan. That even Evan, in his own way, would offer something like brotherhood. But life isn't a movie. Some apologies never come. And the people who broke you will sometimes still pretend they never held the hammer. After Emily's call, I gave myself permission to grieve what never was. Not just their absence, but their potential presence. The father who could have taught me how to fix things with my hands. The mother who could have nurtured instead of nitpicked. The brother who could have stood beside me instead of climbing over me. I didn't lose those things, I never had them. That's what made it worse. You can't mourn the death of something that never lived. Unless, of course, you carried its blueprint in your heart for years. So what did I do? I stopped looking back. I built my own table with seats for those who chose me before I was somebody. Mentors, friends, strangers, who saw my worth without needing a resume, and I mentored young women like underdogs, dreamers, daughters of silence. I started a foundation not in my family's name, but in the name of possibility. We fund scholarships for those who are too ambitious, too emotional, too much for their homes, because I know what it's like to be told, your light is blinding, when in truth, it's needed. One day, I was giving a talk at a tech conference in Seattle, and a young woman approached me after. Tears in her eyes, voice shaking, she said, "You told my story. I didn't think anyone else had lived it." And I realized then all those years of being dismissed. All those nights I lay in bed wondering if something in me was inherently unlovable. They didn't kill me. They forged me. They gave me a voice with teeth and a heart that still knew how to see others. My family still exists. They still have dinners. I still get the occasional group text updates. Birthdays, someone's gallbladder surgery, Evan's third engagement. I don't reply, not because I'm angry, but because I single quotes am free. I have nothing to prove anymore. Not to them, not to anyone, because here's the truth. They never taught me. You don't need permission to belong to yourself. You don't need applause to be worthy. You don't need a seat at their table. When you've already built a banquet of your own. If you're still waiting for them to see you, stop, see yourself, and then let them watch from the sidelines. If they dare, let their silence be your spotlight. Let their absence echo with your name. Because the best revenge isn't success, it's peace. It's joy that doesn't ask for approval. It's a life so whole Their absence doesn't leave a dent anymore. You listening? You who was told you were too much, not enough, a burden, a phase. You were never the problem. You were the blueprint. So stand tall and keep building, because one day they'll look up at the tower you built and whisper, "Was that her?" And you'll smile and walk on.